scripture lesson this morning comes from the Gospel according to John. Jesus is called to the town of Bethany, where his friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha live. He is told Lazarus is ill, but by the time he gets there, Lazarus is dead. It ends with the woman, it says Martha, saying that she believes Jesus is the Messiah. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, and Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Our second reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is not included in our canonical Bible, or is not in our Bible that we normally buy here and that we've been studying. It's there. Is this Apocrypha, from the Apocrypha, or no? Okay, I'm glad you'll explain where they found these Gospels. And anyway, it's the Gospel Mary Magdalene. It starts with a post-resurrection visit by Jesus, where he gives his disciples instructions. Then, after he leaves, it's Mary who teaches the disciples. "The Blessed One greeted them all. 'Peace be with you,' he said. 'Acquire my peace within yourselves. Be on your guard so that no one deceives you by saying, look over here or look over there. For the child of true humanity exists within you. Follow it. Those who search for it will find it. Go then, preach the good news about the realm. Do not lay down any rule beyond what I determined for you, nor promulgate law that the lawgiver, or else you might be dominated by it.' After he had said these things, he departed from them. But they were distressed and wept greatly. 'How are we going to go out to the rest of the world to announce the good news about the realm of the child of true humanity?' They said, 'If they did not spare him, how will they spare us?' Then Mary stood up. She greeted them all, addressing her brothers and sisters. 'Do not weep and be distressed, nor let your hearts be irresolute. For his grace will be with you all and will shelter you. Rather, we should praise his greatness, for he has prepared us and made us true human beings.' When Mary had said these things, she turned their hearts toward the good, and they began to debate about the words of the Savior."
A few years ago, a woman named Libby Schrader was making her living in New York City as a singer-songwriter. you may not have heard of her. She wasn't famous, but she was making a living. She'd had a couple of albums produced, and she'd been on concert tours as the opener for larger, more well-known pop acts. And she loved her work. She also loved the church. She was a cradle Episcopalian, and she loved liturgy, and she loved prayer. And one day, she stepped into a garden next to a church in Brooklyn to kind of get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and she sat down to pray. And the garden was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, so she was praying to the Virgin Mary. And she heard this very clear message while she was praying that said, "Follow Mary Magdalene." Now, this was kind of startling to her because I don't know about you, but I am not used to getting these very clear messages, like a voice speaking to me when I pray. But she heard this very clear voice. So she wasn't quite sure what she was supposed to do about this, so she did what any singer-songwriter would do. She wrote a song. It's called Magdalene. It's out there on the internet. You can find it if you want to find it. And it became the title tune for her next album. But even though after she'd written the song, she felt like there was more that she was supposed to be doing. And she started thinking more about Mary Magdalene and reading more about her. And it kind of became an obsession with her. And so she did what anyone who is obsessed with a New Testament figure might do. She went to seminary. So she went to Union Theological Seminary in New York City, which is the Episcopal Church-related seminary there, and she started earning a master's degree in New Testament studies. She focused on Mary Magdalene. She learned, how to read Greek and Coptic and Aramaic, all of those new first-century languages that the Gospels are written in. Now, one of the really cool things about doing a degree in New Testament studies nowadays, as opposed to like 20 or 30 years ago, or 50 or 100 years ago, is that all of the ancient texts, the very early fragments and copies of the Gospels, are digitized. They're all available now for anyone to read. It used to be that you would have to go to cities, far-flung cities all over the world, to find these copies of these texts in museums or archives or academic libraries. But you don't have to do that anymore. Almost anybody can read them online. And so even a master's student, very new to reading these ancient languages, would have access to these texts. And so Schrader sat down to, when it came time to do her master's thesis, she decided she wanted to focus on Mary Magdalene, of course. And so she sat down to read some of the most ancient texts in relation to Mary. And she sat down to read a text called Papyrus 66. It's the most complete copy that we have of the Gospel according to John that dates from about the year 200. So it is truly ancient. And she discovered something in that text that is so stunning that from now on it will probably change the way that we read the Gospel of John. Now, before I tell you what that discovery is, I want to remind you that there are a lot of Marys in the Gospels, right? There are at least 6 that are referenced or named. We have Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, whose story appears in Luke chapter 10 and also in John chapters 11 and 12. And I'm going to say a little bit more of that in a minute. We have Mary, the wife of, or the mother of James and Joses. Mary, the wife of Clopas, and those are Marys that appear in one or the other of the Gospels at the tomb. We have someone called the other Mary. That's how she's known. In the Gospel of Matthew, she's also one of the Marys that shows up at the tomb at the end. And then, of course, we have Mary Magdalene. Now, it's important to note that there are significant differences in the story of Mary of Bethany from where it's told in John chapter 11 that Liz just read, and Luke chapter 10. So I'm just going to remind you about the story in Luke chapter 10. Here it is. Now they went on their way. Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to what she was saying. Those of you who have heard this story before know that Martha was the busy one who was trying to get everything ready and for serving guests, and Mary was sitting around, right, sitting at Jesus' feet. And Jesus calms Martha down and tells her that Mary is doing the right thing. Now, but notice a couple of things here. There is no village named Bethany in this story. It's just a certain village. And actually, Bethany is in the opposite direction of where Jesus was headed in the course of Luke. So it really couldn't have been Bethany that he went to because he was going on this kind of circuit. And also notice that there's somebody missing from the story. Who's missing? Lazarus, right? There's no Lazarus in this story. So this story, as it's told by Luke, is just about two sisters, Mary and Martha. There's no Lazarus. They don't live in Bethany. So when Schrader sat down to read Papyrus 66, she read the first line of chapter 11 in John's Gospel, and she read this. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, and his sister Mary. And Schrader thought, now wait a minute, that's not what it says in the English translation of my Bible. If you remember what Liz wrote, the first line is this. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. But Papyrus 66, the oldest version of the Gospel according to John that we have, doesn't say that. The first line of Papyrus 66 is, agreed, a very awkward sentence that makes it sound like there are two Marys and no Martha. And Schrader, as she continued reading, she noticed something else. She noticed that there were several places in the text where the name Mary had been changed to Martha. I have a little video of Libby Schrader. She goes by Elizabeth now that she's a scholar instead of a singer-songwriter, describing how this happened.
Here is how the scribe writes the word Maria. This thing that looks like an M is a mu, then the A, then this thing that looks like a P is actually an R, Mar, and then we've got the I, which is a Greek iota, it's got a little mark above it, and then an alpha at the end, Maria. That's how the word is supposed to look. The word Martha is supposed to look like this. We've got the first three letters the same, Mar, and then we've got kind of a nice round letter there that is a theta, and that makes the th sound. So this word says Martha. You can see the difference between the names Maria and Martha is just one letter. It's the difference between the iota, which is like an I, and the theta, which is like a th. Maria, Martha. Now up here, we can see that the name Maria has been changed to say Martha. The way we know that is because the little accent mark from the I has been rubbed out. You can see that it's still rubbed out right there. And also you can see that the theta, the round letter, is very narrow and thin, and it's off center. That's because it was an I, and it has been changed to a th. It's literally just one letter. The iota has been changed to a theta. And with that, the name Maria has been changed to Martha.
Now, this is what happens when you get new eyes on an old text. For hundreds of years, thousands, 1,500 years, people have been reading this text, but in isolation of the other texts. And so Libby Schrader realized something that no other scholars had really noticed before. In addition to changing the name Maria into Martha. There were several other changes as well. Each of the pronouns had been changed in the story. Every singular sister had been changed to the plural, sisters. Essentially, what Libby Schrader discovered was that originally there was no Martha in this story from the Gospel according to John, chapters 11 and 12. Martha is a character from the Gospel according to Luke. The story in John is supposed to be about Lazarus and his sister, Mary. Schrader went on to examine hundreds of different early manuscripts and found that roughly 1 in 5 ancient Greek manuscripts and 1 in 3 Old Latin manuscripts have something strange happening around Martha. Now, all of this suggests, Schrader says, that Martha was added to the Lazarus story by later editors and copyists of the New Testament. Schrader dug deeper and found that the earliest scriptural commentary, such as one from the 3rd century theologian Tertullian, referred to only Mary in this story. So when the early theologians are writing about chapter 11 of John's Gospel, they only write about what Mary did in this story, not Martha. This discovery is so significant that this month, Schrader traveled to Germany to meet with the editors of the Nestle-Aland New Testament. And these are like the keepers of the Greek New Testament, right? This is a scholarly group of editors that edit the Greek text that's used by most scholars, students, and translators today. So if somebody wants to make a new translation of the New Testament, they go to the Nestle-Aland edition in Greek. So she discussed her findings about these changes made in the text of John's Gospel and said that the editors might consider adding a footnote to that effect in upcoming editions. So if they choose to do this, if they think her discovery is significant enough, they will add a footnote to that Greek New Testament that relates her scholarly work. Schrader argues that this Mary in chapter 11, who recognizes Jesus as the Messiah, who will anoint Jesus' feet, is none other than Mary Magdalene. And she suggests that at a very early stage, there was an editorial decision made to copy Martha out of Luke and paste her into John. The purpose of this conflation, according to Schrader, is to distract the reader away from the parallels between Mary Magdalene, who witnesses the resurrection in John 20, and Mary at the tomb of Lazarus in John 11. As Schrader puts it, with Martha in the Gospel of John, Lazarus' sister Mary isn't Mary Magdalene anymore. Instead, she's the nice lady who sat quietly at Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke. Now, another piece of the Magdalene puzzle that Schrader's been exploring is the mystery of Mary Magdalene's name. I said in a sermon earlier this month that women in the first century were usually known by the name of a male relative, or perhaps from the place that they came from. And if you think that we don't do this anymore, my last name, that's my father's name, right? I am known by my father's name. Women today usually are known by the name of their fathers or their husbands. So this is perhaps why this idea that maybe Mary Magdalene is named that way because she's from a place. For centuries, biblical archaeologists have been looking for a place called Magdala. Now, if you go to the Holy Land today and you go to the Sea of Galilee, there's a town that the tour guides will tell you is Magdala, and there's a lovely chapel there that a Catholic order has placed and decided that this is the place where Mary Magdalene is from, and there's an archaeological dig that has found a first-century synagogue, and they like to tout it as Mary Magdalene's church, right? It's Mary Magdalene's synagogue. But the truth is that there is no consensus about where might be a town called Magdala. And there's a reason for that, right? Because the reason they've really never found a town called Magdala is that Mary is probably not named for a town. The word Magdala in Aramaic means tower. So it could be any place that had a tower, right? There were lots of towns that would have a tower. But what is probably going on here is that when we say Mary Magdalene, we're saying Mary, the tower. Just as Jesus gave Simon the name Peter, which means the rock, and he called James and John the sons of thunder, right? It's likely that the disciple Mary also had a nickname. She was called Mary the Tower. It could simply be that she was tall, or it could be that she had an unusual strength and courage. It could be that she had a towering sense of faith. So if, in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is not only the one who comes to the tomb to see the risen Christ and is thus the first apostle, but she is also the disciple who anoints Jesus and the disciple who recognizes that he is truly the Messiah. In the words given to Martha in John 11:27, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world," then she must have been a powerful and important disciple among the followers of Jesus. And there is evidence that Mary Magdalene was considered important to certain communities of Jesus followers in the early days of Christianity. One piece of evidence is the Gospel of Mary. This gospel was discovered in Egypt in the year 1896. It was purchased by a German scholar who was working in Egypt. It was taken back to Germany, and then he began working on a translation of it. But due to a variety of reasons, including 2 world wars, the German translation of the text was not published until the mid-1950s. And then it took another 20 years for an English translation to be published. Ultimately, unfortunately, the first 6 pages of the gospel are missing, and there's a chunk in the middle that is also missing, about 4 pages. And even though there have been other fragments of this gospel discovered in different places, none of them have those missing pages. So unfortunately, that is lost to history. But the fact that there are at least 3 copies, and they are in both Greek and Coptic, indicates that this text is one that circulated widely, not just among one community, but several communities. And it was written in different languages for different communities. The gospel tells of a resurrection appearance of Jesus to the grieving disciples. He tells them to be wary of others, to not create new laws. I love that. He says, don't make new laws lest you be, dependent on them. You have to follow the rules if you make the rules. This is something we haven't really done, right? We've made a lot of rules in the intervening years. And he urges them to seek the peace of Christ, the child of true humanity. That's often translated as the Son of Man. He's referring to that peace of Christ. And when he tells them that lies within you. And this echoes some of the things in other Gospels where Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you. So that peace of Christ, the understanding of that Christ consciousness, the true humanity that Christ showed us, lies within us. When Jesus departs from them, the disciples are frightened and they're in fear for their lives. This kind of echoes the Gospel of John, right? When they are locked in a room because they're afraid of what's going on outside. And Mary addresses them and she tells them to not be afraid, that the strength of Christ will be with them and the grace of Christ will shelter them. What a tower she is in this moment, right? She's the strong one. She turns their hearts to the good, capital G, right? Meaning that message, the good news, the news of the kingdom, the news of the realm of God. And she reminds them that Jesus came to teach them how to be truly and fully human. This is a powerful and uplifting gospel. Nowhere in this gospel is the message that we're sinful people. Instead, the gospel urges us to find the peace of Christ within ourselves and to become more truly and fully human in the image of Jesus. I can't help but wonder what would have happened in the last 2,000 years if Mary's gospel had been one of the ones that we all read. It's apparent that there was a community of believers who read this gospel and who believed that Mary Magdalene was a powerful and important disciple. There were also communities who read the gospel according to John in its original version and read about Mary Magdalene in chapters 11 and 12 and understood her importance to Jesus and his ministry. So what happened? Well, Constantine happened. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 311, he wanted the faith to conform to the Roman way and to the type of faith that was practiced by the soldiers in his army. It's kind of how he heard about Jesus, was from soldiers in his army who had converted. As New Testament scholars Helen Bond and Joan Taylor put it, one of the most striking things about Christianity through to the early 4th century, to this time of Constantine, was its diversity, with different groups in different contexts living out their faith in a variety of ways. That's why we have in our Bible, we have 4 Gospels. There are many other Gospels. It's those Gospels where different communities had recorded the story of Jesus to read and understand. They were told by these different communities, and there was this great diversity of worship and practice and understanding of the message of Jesus. Christian diversity, however, was not a good thing for the emperor. And so when he took charge of the church, he made it his mission to stamp out variance. Constantine presided over a council in Nicaea in 325. This was the very first council of the church, and it was called by the emperor. And it was designed to systematize the churches in line with the type of Christianity that the army and he followed. It will come as no surprise to hear that this was not particularly women-friendly. Leadership roles were now exclusively the preserve of men. Other rules and regulations, such as divorce laws, favored men, and women's earlier roles were diminished or forgotten. And as a result of Constantine's measures, books not approved of by imperial standards, like the Gospel of Mary, were burned. Heretics were excommunicated. And the whole library of Antioch was burned by order of Emperor Jovian in 364. Can you imagine what was in that library? Now, despite the pressure from the empire, some of those diverse communities continued to practice their faith and to read their gospels. But when the authorities got too close, when the persecution became too severe, they buried the books in clay jars in the sand of the desert, hidden for centuries. Some, like the Gospel of Mary, were found and preserved, and others were lost for eternity. What would Christianity, indeed all of Western civilization, have been like if the Gospel of Mary had survived intact? What would it be like if Mary, the Tower, had been revered all this time as a disciple of Jesus and an apostle to the apostles? We can only imagine what that world might be like. I don't know the answer to my questions, but I do know that it is time for the stories of Mary Magdalene and Priscilla and Phoebe and Salome and all our mothers of the faith to fire our imaginations and fire our hearts to bring that imagined world into being. Amen.